So I just want to give everyone a heads up. A quick note, this is the first of 5 Free Friday webinars for members only this fall. And then we are currently finalizing the 12 that will be January through March in 2025. So Mark and I were just talking about how membership has its benefits. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that this will be an accompanying, Mark has put an article in the next edition of the Journal of Employee Assistance, so be on the lookout for that. Also coming up on our agenda this fall, we have a October 24th is fundamentals. So if you know anyone in the profession who is within the first 3 to 5 years of their time in EAP as an EAP, this is a great course to get them going. Plus it as well as gives them the basis to start going through for the seat. And then we will also be having a course on holiday drinking is really what it's about. We'll have an expert coming in to talk about what that is and how you best can be working with your population in how to combat some of the challenges that possesses. So with that, without much ado, I want to welcome everyone to our first in the fall series and present Dr. Mark Gatrich, who we were just discussing has been leading the WOS for a number of years. And it was a Dave tell us who was doing it before that, but it's been going on since 2016. So this is the 8th year. And we also want to mention a salute to the evolving TELUS, who has been sponsoring it ever since then. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. You want to unmute, Mark?
Okay. So you can see my profile on LinkedIn, and there's a lot of resources there, as well as over 200 and some resources, papers, and presentations and such in the Employee Assistance Digital Archive at the University of Maryland, working with Professor Jody Frey and Pat Herlihy. So a lot of resources there from me and from lots of other folks in the EAP field. And we got a number of kind of question answer format for this. I want to start with the first question there, Julie.
What is the WOS, or known as WOS, and the EAP Industry Benchmarking Project?
Okay. So the Workplace Outcome Suite was started by Dave Sherrar and Richard Lennox and Dave Gaynor and a number of other folks in 2010. So I believe, what's that, 14, 15 years ago. And originally it was 25 items, 5 for each kind of outcome area. There's 4 work-related outcomes and 1 general clinical outcome. Because it was so long, though, and EAPs are for-practice businesses, Dave was asked to make a shorter version, and so they took 1 question from each of the dimensions, and there's a 5-item version now that's the most common. We also added a workplace screener question, are you working or not, so the questions are relevant, and also a 0 to 10 job performance question. And what's interesting about it is it takes the person should be completing it twice at pre-use of counseling, usually at the first session or intake, and then at some kind of follow-up later. For some EAPs, are doing it at the last session. We've done a lot of statistics and data analyses to show that it's reliable, and it's also conceptually valid with measures that should be associated with and not associated with other factors that should not be associated with, like age and sex and a lot of the delivery factors. We have found that when people are at a problem level on these different 5 outcomes, the 4 work-related outcomes, if you add up how many people at the start have a problem on one of the 4 work-related outcomes, it's almost 3 in 4 of every counselor user. So even if the issue isn't related to work, which most of the time it's not, they nonetheless have a work-related deficit or a problem in one of the 4 areas. So it's kind of a general measure for EAPs who are supposed to support the workplace. The main findings from all of these studies is it shows we can improve all 5 areas. Also, there are a few factors. We've looked at 19 different factors that may moderate or change or influence the strength of the results. And most of those tests show they're pretty minor differences, other than the more clinically severe the person is, they tend to have a bigger deficit and therefore improve more. And also, there's some fairly large differences between the many different EAPs that have shared data over the years. So some EAPs have a slightly better outcome profile than other EAPs, which is one of the reasons we want to do the project, to have this as a benchmark for the field for EAPs to compare against each other. And then also, I've developed some ways to take the absenteeism and presenteeism questions and convert them into hours of productive work time, and apply some financial factors from your customers to that and come up with a return on investment for the EAP benefit. And there's an example of that in the next article we have in the Journal of Employee Assistance. So here's kind of the big summary so far. There's been over 60 published papers and reports, presentations on the WOS. It's one of the most widely used tools available. Brian McNutt and Jody Frey did a survey last year, and I think they repeated that at the conference. And about 3/4 of all the EAPs that measure work-related outcomes are using the WOS. So it's kind of a standard in the field. But if you look at all the EAPs who are not measuring work outcomes or not using the WOS to do that, 2/3 of the field still is not using this tool. So it is a free tool. It would be nice if people could adopt it to get more data and more comparisons. This is sort of the business history of this. It's gone from Chestnut Global Partners, who developed it, and then they were purchased by Mona Chappell, and that became the LifeWorks product, and then that was purchased, I believe, a year or two ago by TELUS Health in Canada. So it's still the same set of tools, and it's still free to use, but it's sponsored by different groups. Here's a whole listing of all the major white papers that we've done over the years, and all of these are in the EA archive. The one in yellow there is the most recent one. It's almost 100 pages long, has a lot of different chapters on different aspects of the tool and how to use it, and if it's reliable and valid, and comparisons by internal EAPs or external vendors, or comparisons across 6 parts of the world, or comparisons across different other factors. And there's also a video of this. I did an 1.5-hour presentation on it for the Upper Midwest EPA chapter, and that has a lot more detail than we'll get into today. So that video is also available for free to use. So this is the 6th report that we've done. It's the biggest we've ever done. It has over 61 EAPs in total from years 2010 to 2022. We had 26 different EAPs provide fresh or new data that wasn't in the previous report. Because of that, we have a huge sample size now. We believe it's the biggest ever done in EAP history. It's 141,000 cases with information at the start, and then over 62,000 of these that have valid follow-up longitudinal data, what we call repeated measures data.
Next question. What is the descriptive profile of counseling use over 141,000 cases in the full sample for the study?
So this is sort of the benefit of getting all this data, as we can learn how EAP is delivered in addition to the outcomes and the effectiveness. So we have case level data, individual person level data that the EAPs have provided voluntarily, and then we ask them to provide a whole lot of other questions if they have it available. Some of them do, some of them don't. But we ask about what is the provider type, how the EAP benefit is used, and the employer context as the purchaser of the EAP. Just some very basic background questions about the user, mainly age and sex. And then we also ask about how it was delivered and how it was used. We don't actually have any utilization rate data because we don't have all of the people at the company who didn't use the EAP, and we also don't have the other cases who didn't complete the WOS. And so this isn't really a utilization-based analysis in terms of 4 or 5% or 10% use the EAP. It's more about those who use the EAP and those who completed this outcome tool. Here's their profile. I have done other published studies with CareLink EAP and other folks looking at outcome samples, 10 or 15% that get in the sample and those who don't. And they actually tend to be very similar on a lot of the other outcome and profile factors anyway. So this is probably very representative. What we have is 61 different EAP providers with headquarters in 15 different countries. Some of them are multinational employers, and so they have users all over the world that we have data on. About 2/3 of these, 68%, are larger national global EAP vendors. They tend to have more resources to collect more data. That's probably why we have more cases from them. About 21% of the cases are regional or smaller external vendors, even though there's more of those vendors in total. And then also 11% of the cases, which is well over 20,000, are from internal programs of staff who serve one organization, and they may also get some external vendor support, which we call hybrid EAPs. So it's a nice mix of who's providing EAP services over the years. We also have a profile of their contexts, 13 years of data, 43 different countries represented in terms of where the employees are located, all the major geographic regions in the US Census, the 8 major types of industries also are represented, a variety of promotional tactics of sending emails or promotions or trainings or other ways people learn about the EAP. And the fairly typical results of about 95% of cases are the covered employee as opposed to spouse or family. And about 94% of cases are self-referrals. But we do have a small slice of formal management referrals or other people who've referred into the EAP. And there are some interesting small differences on that. In terms of who the actual user is, the client is, this is fairly typical to other research. About 2/3 have a female gender, about 1/3 male, and 1% other. Average age is 38, but it actually ranges from teenage to 20s to 30s to 40s, all the way up into the 80s. So EAP serves a wide range of ages as well as gender. Interestingly, some EAPs have everybody who takes the EAP at the intake scored on the PHQ measure for depression. And on that data, which is many thousands of cases, 44% of cases are at risk for clinical depression when they start, which is a fairly high rate, but also the majority are not at a clinical level. We also added this new question a couple of years ago that's used in a lot of other health research. It asks on a job performance from worst to the best, from 0 to 10, and usually 8, 9, or 10 is considered normal. And so people in 0 to 7 range are about almost 2/3 of EAP cases are below an external standard for job performance. So these kind of life issues, mental health issues, are affecting their work. Therefore, they could have improvement in work-related outcomes. Here's why people are using the EAP. Again, this is probably the biggest measure we've ever had of this, over 122,000 people. Mental health is about half, 47%. Substance abuse, though, is a very small slice in red, about 3%. Family and spouse relationships, marriage relationships are about 1 in 5, 20%. Personal life stress is also a big slice, 19%. And work stress is about 11%. So even though EAPs are designed to support work, and most of the employees, 90-some%, are workers, they're employees, work itself as an issue is not that common. It is in some other countries. We did a big project in Australia and New Zealand, and it's about twice that rate there. But anyway, this is a big profile. Again, a lot of different issues. In terms of how counseling is delivered, 69% use remote technology, online video mainly, or telephone. And a lot of that since, of course, the pandemic started. And about 1/3 are in person at a local office somewhere. The number of sessions used is provided by a small slice of all the cases, but we do have data on that from a number of different EAPs. It ranges from about 3 or 4. One big EAP has a very high rate, so the total average in the study is about 5 sessions per case. The time it takes to deliver these sessions ranges from just 1 day even to almost 12 months. The average, though, is about 2 months, about 60 days. But every EAP that gives us data has a huge range in terms of how their individual users, how often they use the EAP in terms of clinical episode duration. So that actually varies quite a bit by the individual. So I'm going to open it up briefly to some questions here for a minute or two about just the study and about what we've learned about EAP as a profile. You put that in the chat. We could discuss that for a minute. Otherwise, we can move on to some of the other results and stuff.
So there's a question here, Mark. Good afternoon. What is your best advice for a newer EAP looking to implement their first WOS client satisfaction survey? And what system would you recommend to efficiently gather, organize, and analyze the data? Thank you. From Sean.
Oh, thanks, Sean. Good question. Well, Well, one, the tool is free, and so you can get a license to use it. And I have a slide on where to do that. But collecting data typically happens at the start of the session, and then there's some sort of follow-up afterward, usually an email follow-up, or it could be a text follow-up that goes back to an online survey. Most EAPs use some sort of HIPAA-protected online survey that they can connect back to. The challenge is you have to line up the case at the start with the case at the follow-up. So you need some way of connecting the two people based on ID or based on some unique number that you give them to do that. Or if you have someone on your team directly contacting people, then they can keep track who the people are to make sure they match up. And so that's the only challenge, is to have someone manage the follow-up so that the person's data can be aligned up at the pre and the post. It doesn't really matter which survey tool you use. Most of them can do this. Qualtrics is a popular one. I use Survey Gizmo. There's also Survey Monkey. There's different universities that have their own tools if people are at a university. Many big corporations already have a survey tool that they're using for other purposes. The main part is just to manage the longitudinal part of it so you can match up the cases. The actual survey only takes about a minute to complete, so it's not a big burden on the user to do this. We've had very few people who won't fill it out. So in general, you can also follow up with me or follow up with people at TELUS Health about how to do the logistics of it.
I think
And
that's
go ahead.
I think that's it for the questions in chat at this time.
Okay, well, we'll jump ahead.
What specific outcomes are measured in the WOS?
Yeah, so this is actually a little bit more complicated than it sounds. There is 5 constructs that are measured, and they each have a literature of why they're relevant to work and why they're relevant to psychology. And depending on which version of the scale you use, you have 5 questions for each one or just one question. But work absenteeism, how much people are actually not at work when they're supposed to be. And then work presenteeism is really what's the kind of effort and ability to be productive, to focus while they're on the job. And this is a worldwide measure that's in all kinds of studies, that is actually the biggest driver of problems in companies, is people being at work but not performing to the normal level. And there's a number of different measures of that. The WOS is one question to do that. Workplace distress and work engagement are different kinds of questions. They get at more or less, how is the person feeling about their workplace, about their work team, about their manager, about their position in the workplace. And so it's more of an outward focused analysis, as opposed to presenteeism and absenteeism is how I'm doing in my work myself. And so workplace distress and work engagement have a lower level of problems among the population of counseling. Unless they have a work issue, then they're much, much higher. So they kind of get at a different dynamic of the workplace. And then if people are engaged in the workplace emotionally, cognitively, physically, that's sort of the work engagement constructs. And then there's a general question on overall life satisfaction, which is not related to work, but it's designed as sort of a proxy for their clinical status or their general overall level of distress that would be related to why they're seeking counseling. And this also has a big change from pre to post, which is typical in brief counseling research. These are the actual specific questions for the single items. The life satisfaction one is, so far my life seems to be going very well. And they just rate how much they agree with it. The work engagement, I'm often eager to get to the work site and start the day. The workplace distress, I dread going into work. The work presenteeism, my personal problems keep me from concentrating on my work. And then the work absence is a little more specific. How much time did your personal problems cause you to miss work during the past 30 days? This includes complete work days, partial work days, coming in late or early. And then they choose a category here based on earlier research where people filled in the specific number of hours, 0 to 1 to 3 to basically under half a day, almost a day, 2-3 days, or 4 more days. So this is what I've come up with in the past several reports to convert these statistics from mean scores into more simple kind of clinical categories of, do I have a problem on this construct, or is it in the normal range where it's not a problem? And so this is a way to take the same raw data you have with the 1 to 5 scores for each person, and then make a new variable that says, is this a problem, yes or no? And so the problem analysis, I think, is somewhat easier for business people to understand than researchers and other folks who may be looking more carefully at all the details in the data. So the WOS is free. You can get it from TELUS Health. Catherine Modisette generally answers this at workplace at the WOS Analytics at TELUS Health.com email. You could also write to me if you want.
What methodology is used for collecting WOS data?
Well, this relates to what Sean was asking. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. Historically, it's always been done in this, what I call time 1 to time 3 research design or operational policy that you have. This would be sometime at the start of the case, either while they're waiting before they talk to a counselor, or sometime, after the first session, you ask them to complete this brief questionnaire. Some can do it online now when they're registering during online tools to schedule an appointment. They could, fill out this in advance. And then typically, sometime after the last clinical session, they get in a queue to complete this at a follow-up. Now, historically, the follow-ups been somewhere between 30, 60, 90 days. It really depends on the EAP. The results actually don't matter much depending on how far out they go. And so I'm recommending more people do it at a 30-day follow-up just because you get a much higher response rate than as you go out 2 or 3 or 4 months down the road. And the answers seem to be pretty typical. We have about 10,000 cases of data where it's almost 100 days average. So roughly 60 some days of treatment and a month or so follow-up is pretty common. The other way that some EAPs have been doing this, mainly TELUS Health in Canada and 4 countries around the world, plus a number of other EAPs, is they only collect it at the start of case, time 1, at the end of case, time 2, and they don't do any follow-up. Personally, I don't really recommend that because you don't know if the results at the time 2 are going to be consistently going with the person longer after the follow-up. I published another study with Invest EAP in Vermont where we studied time 1, time 2, 3 months, and 6 months. And the time 1, time 2 data was the most positive story of results. They had the most change because the clinical impact was immediate. But then as we went to 3 and 6 months, there was a 10 to 20, 30% drop off where people, didn't have quite as good outcomes if you went out 3 months or 6 months, which is probably more realistic. So it depends on how you want to collect data. Start of case, end of case, you get far more data overall, but it's somewhat positively biased. Some kind of follow-up, at 1, 2, 3 months is recommended. I would like to see EAPs do all 3 of these, time 1, time 2, and time 3. So that's sort of the goal for the future. So this is in our data set looking at the number of individual cases. About 88% have the traditional pre to post with a follow-up. About 12%, though, actually a large number in terms of total cases, have this start of case, end of case. This is the range of how many months it takes to go from the start of case to when they complete the follow-up survey after use. And so you can see in this data set, most of the cases are 1, 2, or 3 months after the last clinical session, just because that's what's been recommended to do in the field. But there are a number of cases that's for various reasons take a long time to get a hold of them. And so it can be done later on. The average is about 96 days from when they started it to when they did the last session. So this also reflects the range of sometimes treatment is a lot longer as well. So it really depends on the individual case. There's not a lot of moderator effects, though, with how long the treatment is or how long the follow-up is. So it's somewhat flexible in terms of you're not going to get dramatically different results for cases that are 1 month versus cases that are 6, 7 to 10 months of use. The results tend to be in the same range. So what's the criteria to do an analysis? Well, in this particular report, we focused on counseling services only, but we do have WOS data from other kinds of EAP services: coaching, work-life, legal, finance, on-site trainings, more clinical depression management programs. We also have different time periods. This was restricted to year 2022 and back. Also, I restricted it to be 1 year of treatment, although most are 30 to 60, 90 days. We also had the minimum of 30 days before start of case and end of case when you collected the data. Now, this is really important because if you're doing data collection at the start of the case and then at the final treatment, for a one session case, that would be collecting, the survey at the start of the case and then at the end of the session, which makes no sense. So you need to have a minimum of at least 30 days between when they first completed the WOS survey and when they did it again, kind of regardless of how many sessions they had. And there's a substantial number of cases that are less than 1 month of treatment or less than 2 or 3 weeks of treatment, about 20% actually in this big data set. So in terms of the WOS to be valid, because there were questions asked in the past 30 days, what's your work experience, what's your life satisfaction? To answer that question in a valid way, there has to, in reality, be 30 days between when you do WOS at time 1 and WOS at a follow-up or at the end of session. So we actually were not able to analyze about 20% of the data because the case treatment was so short and they measured the follow-up WOS right after the last session. And so that's also something to keep in mind where it's better to have the traditional start of case and then some kind of follow-up, 30, 60, 90 days follow-up. The individual person had to complete the WOS both at the start and at the next follow-up, so we could match them up individually to get their same scores. We're not comparing groups of different people at the start of case and at follow-up. It has to be the same case who's being compared. They also had to be working. So we also looked at the absence question if they had number of hours. And if they had a number of hours more than 160 for the past month, which is 40 hours a week times 4 weeks, that means they weren't working at all. And therefore, the WOS questions aren't relevant to them because they're not working other than life satisfaction. And so a very small percentage of cases, about 2 to 5%, said they were not working either at the start or the follow-up. Also, some of the EAPs give us duplicate cases or other reasons that the data is not valid. And then also I adjusted statistically if they had the end of case or a true follow-up in the study results. So we kind of controlled for some of the variation. So this is a scientific sort of careful way to look at your data.
Question 5, what are the overall results for improvement after counseling on the WOS measures for the 62,000 plus longitudinal subsample of the study?
So first of all, holy cow, 62,000 people we have worldwide that have answered the same exact set of questions from many, many different EAPs, many years, many countries. Just being able to answer that question is pretty amazing as the field of EAP. So one, I want to congratulate all these 60-some EAPs over the years that have taken the time to collect the data and then to share it with us to do these kinds of analyses. This is probably the biggest study ever done in the field looking at these kinds of outcomes, just in terms of sample size. So absenteeism is one of the reasons a lot of people are concerned about mental health of employees. They're noticing some people are missing work, or they're maybe going on disability or workers' comp, an extended absence. And so there's a lot of focus on absenteeism. So when we look at the actual data, though, that focus on absenteeism is not warranted at all. When you define this as the number of hours missed from work in the past month due to a personal concern. So it's not missing it for other work-related reasons or vacation days. This is a kind of a distress-related number of absence hours. Worldwide, the average missed is about 8 hours, 7.9 before counseling, the 30 days before. And then at the follow-up, it gets cut in half to about 4.3 hours. However, the average of all the different cases is kind of misleading because well over 50 to 70% at the end have zero absence. And so the most typical finding on a case-by-case basis is zero absence at the start and zero absence later. So absence is really not what folks should be concerned about in terms of all of these issues. When we look at HR data, benefits data, there's a lot of really big data sets and studies I've looked at in the US and other countries that collect this. Missing about 3 hours or so of work in a month for health-related issues is the standard. It's been this way for a long time. So most people miss 0 to 3 hours on average. So I decided that, well, let's have 4 or more is decided as a problem. When we look at that, then only a third of cases, EAP cases, have a problem at the start, but this gets cut in half to about 17 at the follow-up. So there's a huge change. We are effective in reducing about half of the people that have a problem to not have a problem with absence. So that's a big deal. What's not so a big deal is that the actual hours involved are pretty small. It goes from 8 to 4. So it's not that many hours per case that we're changing. When we look at this 1 to 5 rating, like if they agree, not agree, the other 4 questions are rated on the 1 to 5 agreement scale. I made a new scale that I showed you earlier that puts these hours into 5 categories. When you compare that metric, there's a fair way to test it versus the other 4. This is a medium-sized statistical effect, which is a good result. It's a Cohen-D of 34. So this is a real result. It's consistently found in every study we do. The hours are not that big, though, even though it changes by about half. And so what's sort of misleading is some people will say, oh, we had a 50% reduction in absenteeism, and isn't that awesome? And that's correct, but the absenteeism level at the start usually is pretty small. So it's a true effect of big change, but the starting level is not that great. So work loss presenteeism is defined as not being able to concentrate on work because of personal problems. So I can also estimate the hours of lost productive time, which each of the 5 categorical answers of strongly agree, somewhat agree, neutral, strongly disagree, and put a percentage on that for each answer. And that's in the big WOS report if you want to replicate how to create percentage time that is worked, and then you get hours from the percentage of time worked. When we do that with this metric, we go a much higher number of hours at the start, 43 hours compared to 8 for absence. So presenteeism is the big deal. This is what you should be focusing on in your marketing and your results to customers. This goes down from about 43 to 33, so it goes down about 10 hours, which is again about twice as much as absence goes down. So this also is a much larger starting point, and it has a much bigger change in terms of actual hours of work, being productive at work. Now, this is also the most common work problem on the WOS in every study we do in general. 57% of cases when they start counseling are at a problem level of not being able to concentrate at work because of their personal issues. Now, this is almost cut in half to 34%, and so that's a significant change. When I test this statistically, it's a very large effect. It's a Cohen-D of 45, which is substantially large size effect. So this is a very real change that most counseling cases are able to create in their work clients. Now, this is slightly different, workplace distress. Again, this is not so much absence or productivity, but how they feel about the workplace. I dread going into work. This is agreed to by about 1 in 4 people at the start of counseling, 26%. Goes down to 18% after. So again, it's reduced by about a third of the cases. As a mean score, it also changes in the direction we want, but it's a small size effect. So again, this is not directly related to all of the cases, so it shouldn't be as big an effect as the first 2, but it is stronger when the person, the 10% or so or 15% are starting their EAP experience with a work-related specific issue, then this is elevated, and then they improve more too. So when it is a work-related issue, EAPs are able to have more success with that. It's just that it's not as relevant as absence and productivity or presenteeism. So this is sort of the positive side of the workplace effect. This is work engagement. I'm eager to get to work to start the day. This is often related to having more cognitive thinking about your work, about being more emotionally positive about your work, and about behaving in ways that integrate you into the workplace. If you have a stronger measure of work engagement, I've actually published a big literature review on work engagement. And so it's a very common construct employers are interested in, just like presenteeism. So when people start counseling, we find that about a third of them are not eager to get to work. They're not engaged. And this recovers to about 24%. So again, about a third of them recover, who could recover. The ratings on the scale from 1 to 5 show a small size effect. This result, like with workplace distress, is also slightly stronger when people have a work-specific reason to talk to the counselor, which makes conceptual sense. So the final construct on the WOS, again, is not work-related. How is your life overall? Is going very well. we find that when people who disagree with this statement, it's about 35% at the start, goes down to 17% after. So about half of this group recovers, so to speak, to being more positive about their life overall. In a statistical basis, the scores change in the direction we want, and this, like presenteeism, is a large size effect. So if you put all these together, you can see that from a statistical perspective, which is how most science people would look at this results to see, is this real, is this valid, is this even interesting enough to care about, you see a different profile depending on the construct that we test. Now, presenteeism has the largest effect. These are partial eta squared effects, another version of the Cohen-D, but a different way to do the math. Life satisfaction also is a large effect. Absenteeism is in the medium. And then the two workplace-related sort of outward-focused questions are small effects, mainly because it's harder to change the workplace than it is to change a person's ability to cope or to react to what's going on from their own perspective about being focused at work or going to work on time, or their overall life. And so these make sense clinically from different folks I've talked about. There is a way also to rescore a number of the WOS questions in a different direction, 1 to 5, and then add those up to make a score that's from 5 to 25. This is called the WOS Super Score. And I recommend this in general because it adds up all the 5 results at the same time for each person. And that would statistically be a more reliable indicator of their distress, and then they're improving in that after counseling. And what we find is what you would predict, that this is in fact the largest change in the study statistically is if you look at all 5 of these outcomes as a suite, the workplace outcome suite it's called. So as a set, you kind of get your most reliable results adding up all 5 of the scores scored in one direction. So, a low score is not healthy, a high score is healthy, and you can look at these results by the super score. So that is statistically what we would like to see, what we did find, what we have found in this big data set. So this is very exciting.
So there are a couple of questions. First, someone wanted to know about the international aspect of the WOS.
Okay, well, I got about a dozen slides coming next on that. So we'll just hold that
Okay.
until we get the results. Good question.
What if an employee comes while on suspension or other work-related leave? Do we administer to them?
Oh, good question. There's very little data that actually has that, so I don't know what the results would be. Generally, you have to be working to complete the WOS, just because that's how the questions are defined. I think it probably would be relevant to assess some aspects of this. The challenge is if they're off work, they're not working, and so 4 of the 5 questions really aren't relevant to directly assess. So we don't know. Typically, someone on suspension or leave is, 0.5 to 3% of a working population. If EAP use is a small slice, you may not be getting many of those cases in reality unless it's a special project. If it is a whole special project assessing return to work like they do in Canada and some other countries, they have a different set of metrics that are more important about how fast you get back to work, how do you get along with HR, or do you get along with your manager and your work team. Those are much more predictive kinds of outcomes than probably what's on the WOS, although you want people to get back to being productive, to being not absent, and to feel engaged in the work and so forth. But it probably doesn't make sense directly to measure it other than the life satisfaction one.
Dr. Bernie McCann wrote, Mark's latest article in the Journal of Employee Assistance will feature the latest WOS data and more insights into the use of EAPs around the globe, publishing online in November. So that was to follow up. And someone requested the tell us email again. So at the end, would you go back to that slide so that everyone can see the person who to write to get?
Yeah, it's wasanalytics@tellushealth.com. But we can share the slides later too, or you can just email me and I'll tell you. I'm so glad people are interested. So let's jump into some of these other more interesting new results.
What is the descriptive profile of counseling used by different geographic regions of the world?
Well, in the report 2 years ago, I started some of these analyses, and we had a certain sample size that was relevant to do that. With the new report, we have much more data, so we have a more reliable way to look at different global regions. Given the WOS was started kind of in the US, and many of the vendors who participated and keep participating are from the US, vast majority of this data is from the United States, 85%. But we do have a number of other very specific regions that I've created after the fact in the data set based on what country the user is in. And so this is not based on where the vendor is, it's based on where the individual case is from, the individual user. And you can see here a number of regions that are anywhere from 1% up to 5% of the sample. Now that sounds like a small percent, but in terms of real numbers, it's in the thousands for each group because we have such a big data set. So visually as a map, here are sort of the 6 regions around the world. And I put the flag of the country that has the vast majority of data from primarily external vendors that are in those countries. Most of the internal program data comes from the US, who has the more mature internal program model. Although there's a lot in South Africa and some other places as well, but they're not in the WOS data. So it's mainly from the US and North America and from Canada. All of the Canada data is from TELUS Health. There's also a large amount of data from Central and South America, mainly from Brazil, though, which is a TELUS affiliate company. And then in Europe and the UK, there's a lot from England and also some from Ireland, and then from many other smaller countries in Western Europe. Again, much of the data from Ireland and from the UK is from TELUS, who started doing this on every case they could collect a couple of years ago. And then Asia is mainly from China, which also was a Chestnut Global Partners, and then therefore a TELUS Health affiliate. We've had data from China for many years now, generally get a couple thousand a year. And then more recently, we've got some data from major EAPs in Australia and New Zealand. So it's a global data set that has a large number of cases. There's 2 ways I'm going to talk about this. We have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to talk mainly about 2 things. One is the utilization profile, if they had data on different factors here and what that looks like for these 6 regions. And then we're going to have some questions about that. And then I have the results on the 5 main WOS outcomes by each of the 6 global regions. And then we can have questions of that at the end. So it's kind of how are they using it, which again, the sample size is much bigger because only about half have valid follow-up data, but it's still really interesting to look at the user profile at the start. And so that's what I want to focus on. I'm going to go through each region and talk about kind of their profile here on these same set of indicators, and then we can have some questions about utilization. So the United States user profile is a gigantic sample, 120,000 people. Again, vast majority of the study. It's a wide mix of vendors. About 35 different vendors have data, 88% of the total cases. But we also have a dozen internal programs and hybrids who have about 12% of the total data. Is the client a self-referral? It's about 94%. Some are family, but about 5% are work, which is very interesting. Perhaps it gets related to the folks who are also out on disability or leave or other kind of work-structured absence. We do know that when we look at this referral group and some CureLink data that's part of this project, that there's a dramatic drop in absence from when they get formally referred to the EAP, generally from a high level to being 0 at the follow-up. And so absence is one thing that changes a lot for the work referral cases. Also, client benefit status is typically EAP, the employee using the EAP, but also 6% dependents. Average age is 38, but a wide range. Gender is similar to the total sample, mostly female. Counseling use duration, we have the date of the first session used, and we have date of the last session on a number of different EAPs. That's about 63 days, so about 2 months. Average clinical use sessions in the US is about 4 per case. And then there's a mix of how people use EAP. About half have been online video. A lot of that has been in 2020, 21, 22, since pandemic. And then about a third in person, some telephone, some text or email. And then again, a wide range of counseling use, about half mental health, some relationships, some personal, about 9% work. Again, only 3% alcohol, drug. The only real interesting thing with alcohol, drug is that if you go back up here to this part that are the work referrals, they have a much higher rate. I think there's about 20-some% that are alcohol or drug, whereas people that are not referred by their workplace are, 2 or 3%. And so this is an interesting specialty area for EAPs. Now, Canada has a very similar profile, almost 3,000 cases. It's primarily from two vendors in Canada. They have a similar profile on vast majority, 88% are the employee, but a higher level of family using the resource, partly because EAPs do a lot of service delivery in Canada compared to the different provincial health systems. Client age is 42. Client gender, again, is about 2/3 female. Client duration of episodes, again, about 68 average days. Counseling sessions per case, 3.2. Now, in Canada, they do more by telephone than online video, at least in this 12 years of data, and very little in other kinds of text or email, but about 13% in person. Again, there's a similar mix to the US in terms of why they're using EAP. Mental health, relationship, family, personal work life, work issues, and again, a very small amount for alcohol and drug. So the UK and Europe region sample is a correct label, but it's really a mix of a lot of different individual countries. Vast majority, 94%, are from United Kingdom and Ireland. Again, all those are from TELUS Health mainly, but some other smaller EAP, maybe global international kind of expatriate people who are in different countries, including United Kingdom and Ireland. But then there's these other countries as well that have a small percentage of cases, hundreds of cases in each group. France, Germany, Greece. Oh, Hungary there should be on a separate line, but you can see the other countries there. UK and Europe as a user profile, about 3,000 some total cases, vast majority from vendors, 98%, a couple internal programs in these other countries. Vast majority here, again, are client benefit, 98%, very few family or work. Age is about the same. Skin majority female. Duration is a little bit lower, 39 days on average versus about 60 in the US or Canada. Counseling sessions is about the same per case, so at 4. Although much more of this delivery is done by telephone than online or video, 75% by phone. And then the counseling use profile, why they're using it. Again, the majority of mental health, next majority work life and stress. That's fairly typical, but 20% for work. In Canada and the US, it was more like 10% for work. And then the less on relationships and even less on alcohol or drug, less than 1%. So Australia and New Zealand user profile, again, a large sample, 4,460. Fairly even mix between the two countries, Australia and New Zealand. This is a 100% vendor model. These are TELUS Health vendors that purchased other local Australia and New Zealand EAPs in the past couple of years. We don't have referral status. We do have 95% employee, 42% average age, which is similar. Again, 2/3 or so are female gender, which is similar. 68 average days per case, which is fairly similar to the US and Canada. A little more than the UK. About 3.2 sessions per case. Now, what's different here is that the majority of cases are in person, 62%, where only about 1/3 are telephone, and some online video, 0 text or email. What's also different here is mental health was not the top ranked area. It was personal life or stress, mainly personal stress. And then also what's really different is that 28% were work-specific issues when they wanted support, as opposed to roughly 10% in other US and Canada. North America, work was about a 1/3 of that. And the mental health was about 1 in 4. Relationships or family are about 1 in 5. And again, a very small percentage, less than 1% alcohol or drug. We have another region of the world with China and East Asia countries, a huge sample, 7,106 cases. 84% though are from one country in China, which is of course an enormous country, so a lot of different locations within China. The remaining 16% though come from these other East Asian countries, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, some from the Philippines. There's a lot more work of EAP being popular in Singapore, but we don't have WOS data on that yet. More details about China and East Asia. Again, it's mainly from 6 different vendors, 98% vendor model. Client referral is similar. Vast majority are self-referral. Again, vast majority are the employee as opposed to dependents in the family or work. Average age is a little bit younger at 31. Some of the other things we looked at were other countries are in the 40s, early 40s, so slightly younger population of workers. Similar profile on age. on gender, about 2/3 female. Don't have data on how long the case episodes were, and we don't have data on the modalities of delivery, but we do have it's 3.7 sessions per case, which is typical to the other regions we've looked at. What's different also here in the China and East Asian group is why they're using the EAP. About half of it, 50%, are for personal life or personal stress, which is lower in other countries. And about 26% are work, which is the somewhat highest level of all the different countries. And then again, what's very low here, atypically low, is relationship or family, only 2%. This is typically 20%, 25% in all the other regions. And also alcohol and drug is again very low, less than 1%. So another region that we've looked at is country of Brazil and other South American countries. Again, it's a big sample, over 2,100 cases. But again, 94% are from one country, Brazil. And you can see all the different other specific countries that come from. Again, it's majority vendor. It's about half female, 4 sessions per case. Vast majority, though, were telephone. And then a wide mix of the different cases. Again, personal life stress, mental health. Work is, again, smaller at 9%. Alcohol, drug is, again, very low. So these are 6 different regions. We have enough data to compare a lot of different things. This part of it alone is an interesting study worth publishing. There were some differences on the mix of delivery and the kinds of presenting issues primarily. So, the rank ordering of the different categories of why they used EAP was slightly different. And so to me, those are interesting areas, but we got about 10 minutes left. Why don't we answer a few questions and then I'll get to the major results by country.
Aren't too many. Have any investigative studies been performed to explore why global regions address work issue counseling more than the US and others where mental health is the primary presenting issue?
Well, there's a pretty wide global literature. Most of it does not involve the WOS specifically. I think there's a huge focus mainly on mental health when people talk about EAP or workplace mental health services, especially a lot of the new digital providers mainly talk about mental health and not about work and family and substance and all the other things that EAPs deal with. So there's a large literature on that. I'm not really sure if it differs that much by different countries. When we look at actual data on the same metrics, there's not a lot of differences in workforces globally from what I can tell, based on some of the standard metrics of clinical prevalence of problems, for instance. There are probably differences in how many seek counseling from public sector or private sector or from EAPs, but there's not a lot of good data to directly compare those kinds of rates. It's a good question, but we'd have to kind of spend a little more time looking into the literature to answer it better.
As a company grows in size or merges with another, is it possible to track changes in workforce and/or suggest ways to help ease the transition?
Well, EAPs have a lot of experience with that, especially the bigger internal programs that support really big organizations and how they change or grow over time. I do think that many countries are interested in standard metrics, a sort of annual workforce analyses they do. Many use a workforce engagement survey, for instance, that they do every year, and they try to compare different regions or locations or parts of the business as it changes over time, especially before and after acquisitions or downsizing. And so there's, again, quite a large literature on that. Very little of it has work-related outcomes other than maybe absence. And that's just missing from work. It's not self-reported absence. So they need to do a much better job, actually, of standardizing the research in those areas to looking at organizational level change. The challenge is many EAPs are not invited to do that generally because they're seen as sort of a clinical benefit. So again, the internal programs have a better opportunity to assist and provide strategy in those areas, at least from the folks I talked to. You may get a better answer if we were to talk to the Employee Assistance Roundtable, which has about 50 internal programs in the US and internationally that help organizations at a more strategy level. But I haven't seen it directly with WASP-related data. One more question, if we can.
Elizabeth wants to know about, is there any data for the Middle East?
Yes, but it's only like less than 100 cases, so we really can't present results directly on it because the sample isn't big enough. There's some from Abu Dhabi, but we need to get, and they just did it 1 year. They didn't continue doing it, so we need to get more participation from those areas of the world if we can.
I think that's it. Is there any other questions out there? If anyone wants to raise hands or put anything in the chat.
Well, someone said they could help. That would be great.
I
Well, I'm
will
going to leave
remind
it at,
everyone that this is the first in 5 Free Friday webinars for our members for this fall, and then there'll be 12 coming up starting in January. So it's an exciting benefit, and we're glad all of you are here. Well, Mark, you want to finish up and give us your final comments? I want to thank you for coming and sharing this with all of us. Question 7, what are the WOS results or different geographic reasons? I think we really
yeah.
covered. So,
So these are in the bigger report coming up. I just wanted to show you them. The general story is things are pretty similar overall, and that effectiveness changes in each of the countries to similar degrees, but the starting levels are somewhat different. You can see on absence here, the starting levels of problems and absence are much lower in China and Brazil than in most of the other countries. I'm not sure why, but that's consistently been every year we look at the data. Presenteeism is fairly similar in all of the regions. It's slightly lower in China, but not really statistically different in the countries. And they all improve, about 50 to 40%. Workplace distress, again, has a very different profile, just like with absence, where it's very low in Brazil and it's somewhat higher in the other countries. And yet it's quite high in China and other Asian countries where they were the lowest in absence. So they're not focusing on absence, but they are distressed about going into work. Now, engagement, the positive sides, being eager to work, is the healthiest in Brazil. They have the lowest rate of problems in this area, and it's the least healthy in UK, in England, and Ireland, where the highest level of cases, 43%, are not engaged in their workplace. But that's similar to China and Canada, and pretty close in the US and Australia. So these are fairly similar, except for Brazil, which kind of has the healthiest profile on engagement. The overall clinical change here in terms of life satisfaction, again, really doesn't differ much statistically by the 6 regions. It goes from 28% in Brazil to being, not happy with their lives to, high 30s, 40s in the other countries. So again, fairly similar profile. All of them improve about 40, 50% afterward, which is what we typically find. When we look at the super score and add this all up in terms of do you have 1 problem or 0 problems up to all 5 issues with a problem, you can see Brazil here has sort of the healthiest profile of all the regions overall, and going up from China to USA to Australia, New Zealand to Canada to UK, kind of being the most distressed in terms of these work factors and life satisfaction compared to the other regions. So again, this is sort of a story of some differences, but not dramatic differences. And you can see each of these bars goes down quite a bit. So there's significant statistic sizes and effect sizes for improvement in all 6 regions, but the starting levels are somewhat more severe or less severe depending on the global region. So to put that into kind of a summary slide, there are a range of relevance. How many cases that, for every 100 cases that seek help at an EAP, what percent have a problem on these different constructs of outcomes? There are some differences in the starting levels. So absenteeism ranged from 13% to 44%. That difference of 31 points. That's pretty big. What's going on with China and Brazil that is so much lower than the rest of the world, so to speak? That would be interesting to explore. Workplace distress also had a wide range, 28% from 14 to 42. Again, Brazil was lowest. In this case, China was highest. Work engagement has, again, a fairly large difference, 17 to 43. Presenteeism, 49 to 70, and so forth. So overall, there's some differences in the starting point, but this is the main sort of highlighted point of the whole talk today. Despite the differences in where the starting levels of the outcomes are, the longitudinal careful statistical tests indicated that none of the WASP measures had a rate of improvement, how much actually changed from pre to post, that differed meaningfully from the different countries. Statistically speaking, they were all trivial effect sizes for global region as a predictor factor. So it doesn't really matter in terms of is it effective. So the bottom line is brief counseling from EAPs was effective to a similar extent for clients living in many different countries all over the world. This also article is coming out in a nice looking format that Tim Varno is producing with us and Bernie McCann's the editor. And so this should come out in November. So you'll have a nice, 3 or 4 page colorful description of all the stuff I'm talking about that you could then share with your colleagues or your managers or your customers in the next 4 weeks or so. So I'm very excited about that. EPA does a great job with this journal, and I'm happy to share these results. And we got a couple minutes for final comments.
There is a question about Italy, since it has an amazing workplace environment. Was it involved in the WOS?
Not so much that there's enough data to analyze. I imagine there is, a handful of cases, but not enough to look at their story yet. I'd like to hear more about why they have a good work culture, though. That would be great.
Any other questions to finish out for the day? All right, well, we will give you back 2 minutes of your time. Thank you so much again, Dr. Mark Attridge. We appreciate you presenting this. The summary sheet, the summary WOS is on our research page. If you go to eapassn.org and then resources, and it is on there under research. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Mark or give our office a buzz. We're there to help. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and go out and get involved and have some mental health time.
I have a final comment. I wanted to thank EPA for being a sponsor and promoting this workplace outcome benchmark. And also, of course, to thank the different financial sponsors over the years, Chestnut and LifeWorks, and now TELUS Health. So thank you for sponsoring this project that everybody gets to learn from and benefit from.
Thank you to them. We appreciate it. We couldn't do it without them. So
Yep.
thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.